cassette. Author's note. Chattel slavery, as it was practiced in the Americas, was a brutal system that reduced human beings to property with no more rights than livestock or household furnishings. This is a book about a few of the men and women, slaves and free blacks, Northerners and Southerners, whites and Native Americans, who became rebels against that system. For a long while, history dismissed these people as dangerous lunatics and murderers whose logic and wisdom were questionable. Sometimes they were portrayed as people driven to a madness where drastic action seemed the only available course. To some, however, they were heroes and martyrs, worthy of honor and remembrance, because they stood up against one of the vicious forms of human oppression, very often without the slightest chance of ultimate success. Their rebellious acts, however, served as a constant reminder of the moral and political dangers of slavery. As rebels for a righteous cause, they should be remembered for the terrible risks they knowingly took, the extraordinary determination they displayed, and the important role they played in the abolition of slavery. We would like to thank all of those who helped us complete this project. Our research has taken us from the Caribbean to New England, from Florida to New York, and from the Everglades to Harper's Ferry. We owe a debt of gratitude to all the people who helped us during our visits to historical societies, museums, tour houses, universities, and libraries. We would like to thank our family, especially Moses Andrew McKissett, whose help can't be measured. As always, a special thanks to our editor, Ann Reet, or Wright, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, Patricia and Frederick McKissack, St. Louis, Missouri, June 1995. A Song of Rebellion. Arise, arise, shake off your chains. Your cause is just, so heaven ordains. To you shall freedom be proclaimed. Raise your arms and bare your breast. Almighty God will do the rest. Blow the clarion, a warlike blast. Call every Negro from his task. Wrest the scourge from Buckra's hand, and drive each tyrant from the land. Blacks along the Sea Island coast of South Carolina developed this song, which expresses their commitment to an armed struggle for freedom. Introduction. Slavery is as old as recorded history, and so are slave rebellions. Whenever and wherever slavery has existed, there has been resistance to it, ranging from individual acts of defiance to well-organized armed revolts. One historian summarized it even more simply. The cause of slaves' revolts is slavery. Support for that idea can be found on the walls of ancient Egypt pyramids. Hieroglyphs show slaves using sabotage, work slowdowns, physical mutilation, and armed rebellion to free themselves from the tyranny of slavery. For centuries, the stories of Moses and the Hebrews of ancient Egypt and Spartacus, who led a slave army against Rome, have served as an inspiration to oppressed people everywhere. By the time Christopher Columbus, in search of a shorter route to India, stumbled upon a Caribbean island in 1492, which he named San Salvador, slavery was not a new institution and rebellions were not a new response to it. When the Americas were opened up for European colonization in the 16th century, slavery came with it. After taking hold in the Caribbean islands, slavery spread to the north early in the 17th century. Right? Let me make sure I ain't missing anything. Conspiracies and uprisings surfaced almost immediately. On July 26, 1740, the South Carolina Assembly submitted a report to King George II, noting there had been an insurrection of our slaves in which many of the inhabitants were murdered in a barbarous and cruel manner, and that no sooner quelled than another projected in Charlestown, and a third lately in the very heart of the settlements, but happily discovered in time enough to be prevented. Resistance against slavery continued until the 13th Amendment was ratified on December 18, 1865, officially ended slavery on the North American continent. Slavery in Cuba and Brazil continued into the 1880s. And honestly, slavery probably continued to about the 1960s or so. For centuries, the lie that African people were happy and contented in bondage was accepted as true. However, a large body of historical data gives us a more accurate picture today. On the huge Caribbean and South American sugarcane plantations, slaveholders lived in constant fear of insurrections, and with good reason. First, planters were usually outnumbered by their slaves, and according to historian Eugene D. Genovese, author of Roll, Jordan Roll, and other works about slavery. No people in world history rose in revolt so often, or in such numbers, or with so large a measure of success than the slaves of the Americas. Caribbean and South American slaves rose more often and in larger numbers than those in North America. The rebels of the Old South, such as Cato, reputed leader of the Stoner Rebellion, Gabriel Prosser, and Denmark Vesey, Nat Turner, the five blacks who fought with John Brown and others, planned and led rebellions with no less courage or conviction. Actually, slaveholders panicked at the mere mention of a plot or a conspiracy, real or imagined. And local and state officials overreacting, something ain't right. Actually, slaveholders panicked at the mere mention of a plot or conspiracy, real or imagined, and local and state officials overreacted by trying to suppress all evidence that there had ever been one. It was generally believed, though seldom discussed among whites, that most slaves didn't have the nerve to lead a rebellion, but if one was started, they would have no problem joining it. In public, people were forbidden to speak the name of a rebel or the revolt he or she led. One 18th century Virginia plantation owner, referring to Nat Turner's revolt of 1831, wrote in his diary, "There was an uprising in Southampton, but I dare not speak of it." Authorities almost always inflated the number of people involved in the conspiracy and insisted upon swift and severe punishment, which sometimes meant many innocent people died. Suspects were rounded up, quickly tried, found guilty, and publicly executed based on the flimsiest of evidence. Even to the day, they still do this in court. You know what I mean? This is why you're guilty to proven innocent in America. In reality, most pre-Civil War revolts were local and involved small numbers of people. After the authorities had suppressed the rebel movement and the immediate danger had passed, slaveholders pushed for the passage of harsh slave laws, limiting the movements of slaves and terminating what few privileges they had. Following the Stoner Rebellion in South Carolina on September 9, 1739, which was much too large to be kept quiet, South Carolina, followed by North Carolina and Virginia, passed a law forbidding blacks to make or have in their possession a drum because it was considered an instrument of rebellion. African drummers could talk to each other over great distances. During the 18th century, the revolutions that took place in France and America set before the world the revolutionary concept that liberty and equality were the rights of all men, not just a privileged few. These ideas were inherently dangerous in slaveholding societies. Motivated by such ideas, Toussaint Louverture led a slave revolution that began in 1791 on the French colony of Saint Domingue and ended with the abolition of slavery there and the formation of Haiti, the first black nation in the Western Hemisphere. Toussaint Louverture's victory over the French was a chilling reminder to North American slaveholders that such an uprising was possible in their own states. In some South Carolina counties where blacks outnumbered whites almost 5-1, there was an attempt to keep knowledge of the events in Haiti from filtering into the slave quarters. But hard as the slave masters tried, nothing could stop the news of Haiti's success from reaching the slaves. Toussaint Louverture's name was spoken with reverence. From city to city, farm to farm, word of his victories was shared in holes in the ground where blacks held secret pit schools and stables in the fields and the kitchens and blacksmith shops. When Haiti's rebel army triumphed over the French, slaves everywhere found hope in a renewed dream that one day they might live in a world free of slavery. One master wrote that he feared the importation of revolution from the Caribbean, but he failed to recognize that the seeds of rebellion had been planted early in 1776. Blacks had fought for independence in the Continental Army and held their ground at Bunker Hill. Was it so unreasonable, then, that slaves who fought for the lofty ideas set forth in the Declaration of Independence would want to harvest life, liberty, justice, and freedom for themselves and their families too? And wouldn't they, when denied those basic human rights, take up arms to fight for them, just as their masters had? The events of the last half of the 18th century helped set the stage for the drama leading up to the Civil War. More than a few scholars believe that Gabriel's Rebellion of 1800, Denmark Vesey's of 1822, and Nat Turner's of 1831 marked the beginning of a new kind of rebel, one motivated by Toussaint Louverture, the Declaration of Independence, and the French Revolution. Up until then, the goal of most rebels had been to secure freedom from slavery. Toussaint Louverture and Prosser's goal was to overthrow slavery as a social system. Such an idea was frightening to the planter class. To help protect their slave economy and their privileged way of life, which is increasingly under attack from northern abolitionists, and to limit the possibilities of future slave results, Southern authorities felt it was in their best interest to keep their slaves profoundly ignorant. By 1850, it was against the law in every Southern state to teach a slave to read and write. It is interesting to note that many slave owners continue to teach their slaves in spite of the law. A second more strict pardon. A second more strict fugitive slave law was passed too, which meant that runaway slaves were no longer safe once they reached a free state. That didn't stop them from running. A rebellious group of otherwise law-abiding people defied the law of the land and formed a network of escape routes that helped slaves find their way to Canada and Mexico on the Underground Railroad. As the struggle for the abolition of slavery continued, militant black abolitionists such as David Walker and Henry Highland Garnet became more outspoken about the role free blacks should play in the emancipation of all enslaved people. Both men called for action, even if it meant armed rebellion. Slaves lived in a hostile and controlled environment where most of their energy was spent on surviving the harshness of their sunrise to sundown existence. Denied the right to hold meetings or travel about freely made it hard to map out plans. Since most slaves couldn't read or write, all communication had to be conducted verbally, which meant messages and instructions were frequently confused or misinterpreted. Weapons presented another problem. Slaves had little or no access to guns, and the few knives and axes they were able to secure were no match against the well-armed militias they would have to face, and there was the constant fear of bounty hunters and betrayal. Some of the earliest revolts were combined efforts between blacks and Native Americans, or poor whites and blacks. Slaveholders soon learned that the divide and rule tactic was a very effective way to deter the possibility of rebellion. Poor whites, whose circumstances were not much better than slaves, were encouraged to feel superior to people of color, whether free or black. From generation to generation, the gap between the two groups widened as racism became more entrenched in American society. For the whites, it was more profitable and less dangerous to catch slaves or serve as overseers than to join them in rebellion. Runaways also saw allies among Native Americans. Fleeing into Indian territory, they set up maroon communities, but slavers used specially trained tracking dogs to hunt down their settlements. The slaves called this being hounded. Slaveholders sponsored the passage of laws that permitted the trading of blankets and skins to the Indians for the return of runaways, and they insisted that fugitive slave clauses be included in all treaties. They encouraged the practice of slavery among the various native groups. Those tribes, such as the Seminoles, who refused to take part in the bounty system, found themselves facing the guns of the United States Army, Marines, and Navy, who had come in part to get their property back by force. Closer to home, masters promised to free any slave who turned in a rebel and granted special favors to informants. A former slave who was interviewed in the 1930s said, "Our masters taught us to be against one another, and no matter where you would go, you would always find one slave that would tattle." Such bribery worked. Denmark Vesey's and Gabriel Prosser's revolts were betrayed by insiders before they ever happened. It is no wonder that Harriet Tubman said, "I kept my eyes on the target, trusting no one but God and my wits. I never took time to study on what I was doing, because if she had, she might have never escaped and then been able to return to rescue others. I just did what I had to do," she said. And basically, this is what all rebels did. This book will not address every American slave rebel or revolutionary action. That would take volumes. We will not detail all of the rebellions of the Caribbean islands and South America, for they were myriad, but we will highlight Haiti's Toussaint Louverture and the African rebel Sink, because of the impact of their revolts had on the rebels of the Old South and the abolitionist movement in general. The leaders we have chosen were all people of courage and purpose, totally committed to their cause and motivated by the highest of principles. They were human beings with strengths and weaknesses, failures and successes. With rare exception, most of these rebels knew that for them, the complete abolition of slavery was a non-negotiable issue between their masters and themselves. The only course of action they believed open to them was to end their enslavement by force. Sadly, for all involved, in the end, force is what it took.